In the great hierarchy of legacy American carriers, World Airlines, distinguishable by its iconic red and white livery, was among the most respected and recognizable, gaining its place in the industry under the influence of the enigmatic Howard Hughes and rising to prominence throughout the 1940s and 50s to become one of the most distinct airlines in the world and a symbol, alongside the likes of Pan American and Eastern Airlines, of the golden age of air travel. However, TWA's decline from the 1960s onward was long and painful, with the carrier's failure to move rapidly with the times, a notable slew of management fallouts, airline deregulation, and one of the most notable accidents in American aviation history, seeing this once major player of the market be squeezed until it could no longer remain competitive. And while it was able to outlive the likes of legacy carriers such as Braniff, Pan Am, and Eastern, by the end of the 1990s, it was clear that there was no room left for the famous TWA. The story of World Airlines begins at the end of World War I, when following the conclusion of the conflict, a surplus of aircraft and a generation of experienced pilots, many of whom were eager to continue flying in peacetime, allowed for the formation of various airlines across the world, though the infrastructure and financial foundation necessary to sustain commercial aviation was almost entirely absent, with airfields being rudimentary, weather forecasting primitive, and aircraft unreliable. The Airmail Act of 1925, often described as the cornerstone of the modern American airline industry, was the first decisive step towards transforming aviation from an eccentric pursuit into a serious commercial enterprise, as by opening up the carriage of mail to private operators, the United States government effectively provided a subsidy system that allows small companies to experiment, fail, and sometimes flourish. And through these contracts, the seeds of future airlines were sown, and the outlines of a national air network began to appear on the map. In those early years, aviation remained a perilous business, with aircraft being fragile and underpowered, their wooden frames and fabric skins ill-suited to the rough airfields of the American interior, while the appeal of air travel was limited largely to adventurous spirits, businessmen in a hurry, and the occasional wealthy traveler seeking novelty, though for all its danger and discomfort, the promise of flight was irresistible. Among the first to seize this opportunity was Western Air Express, a small but ambitious company based out of Los Angeles, which inaugurated services between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City in April 1926, and flew under a government contract that guaranteed payment for every pound of mail delivered, though these initial operations were powered by small, open-cockpit biplanes built by Douglas, with room for a single passenger beside the pilot. However, while the flights were rough, noisy, and often delayed by weather or mechanical trouble, the journey across the desert and the mountains was both a technical and logistical triumph, demonstrating that scheduled flight could be made to work even in the most demanding conditions, and though travel by train remained infinitely more comfortable, reliable, and civilized, each small success helped to erode public skepticism about aviation. The industry's fortunes were transformed in May 1927 when a young airmail pilot named Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone in his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, with his feat suddenly making flight heroic, and Lindbergh became an international celebrity, his achievement a symbol of American ingenuity and daring, with the result being a surge of investment and enthusiasm for aviation unmatched in any other industry of the time. Airfields sprang up across the country, manufacturers raced to produce new aircraft designs, and a host of new companies appeared, all hoping to capture some portion of this exhilarating new market, one of which was Transcontinental Air Transport, or TAT, as formed in 1928 with Lindbergh's personal involvement, and sought to link the Atlantic and Pacific coasts in an unprecedented 48 hours, half the time the fastest trains could manage. The service combined air and rail, with passengers flying by day and travelling overnight in Pullman sleepers, with the two modes dovetailing seamlessly across the continent, with Lindbergh personally surveying the route, selecting the airfields, and ensuring that the network of radio beacons and emergency landing grounds were up to the task, with this enterprise being both glamorous and daring, combining aviation with the luxury and reliability of the railroads. TAT's sleek Ford trimotors were marketed as the Lindbergh line, and the company courted the rich and famous, emphasizing safety and sophistication in equal measure, though for all its grandeur, the venture was fragile, as with the Depression looming, weather forecasting being uncertain, and navigation in bad conditions remaining primitive, accidents and delays were frequent, but TAT nonetheless gave American civil aviation a new sense of purpose and prestige. By the dawn of the 1930s, however, the exuberance of the previous decade had begun to fade, with the Wall Street crash and the ensuing economic collapse leaving the country reeling, and aviation, still dependent on government mail contracts, was particularly vulnerable, with dozens of small airlines finding themselves struggling to survive, with their balance sheets being propped up by the steady trickle of airmail income, though few had the capital to expand or modernize. Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown, appointed by President Hoover, saw consolidation as the only answer, and convinced that too many undercapitalized companies were competing for too few routes, he set out to rationalize the industry through a series of meetings later known, somewhat derisively, as the S'mores Conferences, with his intention being to create a small number of strong, stable carriers capable of operating reliable national networks. Through negotiation, persuasion, and in some cases outright compulsion, Brown encouraged mergers that would knit together the patchwork of regional operators into a coherent system, among them being Western Air Express, which by this time had absorbed Standard Airlines, and under the leadership of Jack Fry, brought to the table a combination of practical flying experience and managerial acumen rare in the business, while TAT, though struggling financially, possessed the glamour and publicity power of Lindbergh's name. On July 16, 1930, under pressure from the Postmaster General, the two airlines were brought together to form Transcontinental and Western Air, with the newly created carrier being allocated the central transcontinental route linking New York and Los Angeles via St. Louis, Kansas City, and other key Midwestern stops, with its early flights being operated by sturdy but aging Ford trimotors. The merger itself was more an arranged marriage than a love match, with the two companies having been rivals and operated in very different ways, but it produced an airline that combined technical competence with a touch of glamour, though the first months of the operation were anything but easy, with the Great Depression continuing to suppress passenger demand, while the Lindbergh line still required an overnight stop in Kansas City, where passengers stayed at the company's own Air Rail Hotel, with the journey across the United States, at best, taking 36 hours, later cut to 24 hours as operations became more efficient. Despite its technical success, the service was hemorrhaging money, and by early 1931 losses had become alarming, compounded further by the March 1931 crash of a TNWA Fokker F-10A near Matfield Green, Kansas, killing all on board, among them Knute Rockne, the legendary Notre Dame football coach and one of the most famous men in America, with investigations revealing structural failure of the aircraft's wooden wing as the cause, a flaw inherent in its design that prompted the grounding of all Fokker trimotors. With public confidence rattled and the airline in a perilous position, Jack Fry emerged as the airline's most dynamic figure, believing fervently that the company's survival depended on new technology and that the Fokker disaster could only be overcome by developing a truly modern all-metal airliner that would inspire confidence among passengers and regulators alike. Boeing's new 247, the most advanced transport of its time, was off-limits, as every example had been reserved for Boeing's sister company United Airlines, but undeterred, Fry turned to a relatively young aircraft manufacturer in California, the Douglas Aircraft Company, whose founder, Donald Douglas, was persuaded to take on the challenge of designing an airplane that could outperform the Boeing and meet TNWA's demanding specifications. Fry insisted that the new aircraft must be able to fly 1,000 miles at 150 miles per hour while carrying at least a dozen passengers in comfort and safety, and crucially, let it be all metal and capable of sustaining flight on one engine if the other failed, with Douglas accepting the challenge, and in less than 2 years produced the prototype DC-1, which made its maiden flight in July 1933 and was an impressive spectacle. Though only a single example was ever built, it proved to be the forerunner of the Douglas DC-2, which entered TNWA service in May 1934, with the arrival of the DC-2 transforming not only the airline's fortunes, but also public perceptions of air travel itself. As compared with the lumbering trimotors of only a few years earlier, the new Douglas aircraft was a revelation, being faster, quieter, and immensely more reliable, with transcontinental flying times being cut almost in half, and for the first time passengers could cross the United States in a single day. While TNWA was modernizing its fleet, the wider American airline industry was in turmoil, as allegations of political favoritism in the awarding of airmail contracts brought down Postmaster General Brown's carefully constructed system of subsidies, and in February 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt abruptly cancelled all contracts, transferring the carriage of mail to the U.S. Army Air Corps. This decision proved disastrous, as the Army, underprepared for such a task, suffered a series of fatal crashes that shocked the nation and persuaded the government to return airmail operations to the civilian airlines. Though in order to qualify for the new contracts, TNWA, like several other carriers, needed to make a minor alteration to its title by adding the word incorporated, a legal technicality that satisfied the authorities and allowed it to continue trading while some competitors were forced to start afresh under new names. In the midst of this upheaval, Fry and the celebrated First World War ace Eddie Rickenbacker, then head of Eastern Air Transport, made headlines by flying the DC-1 from Los Angeles to Newark in just over 13 hours, with this flight, a symbolic gesture at the end of the Army's troubled mail operation, demonstrating beyond doubt that the new generation of airliners had come of age and heralded a faster, more confident era in American aviation. In 1937, the even more capable DC-3 entered TNWA service, and it quickly became the aircraft that finally made coast-to-coast flying both practical and profitable, with TNWA's own fleet, proudly branded as luxury skysleepers, ushering in a new standard of refinement, with the interiors featuring deep upholstered seats that could be converted into sleeping berths, soft lighting, and attentive stewardesses who ensured that passengers were cared for throughout their journey. Yet even as the DC-3 was revolutionizing air travel, Fry's restless ambition drove him to look further ahead, as he understood that technological progress in aviation was relentless and that TNWA could not afford to stand still if it wished to maintain its position at the forefront of the industry, with the next great leap, he believed, coming from conquering the limitations of altitude. Above 15,000 feet, thin air and turbulence made flight both uncomfortable and unreliable, and the solution lay in the development of the pressurized cabin, a radical new concept that promised smooth flying above the weather and across vast distances, with Boeing's experimental Model 307 Stratoliner embodying this idea, with its circular cross-section fuselage allowing the cabin to be sealed and pressurized, maintaining a sea-level atmosphere even while cruising at 20,000 feet. Fry immediately recognized the potential of this machine and placed an order for several examples in 1937, though this enthusiasm met resistance from a cautious board of directors, anxious about the enormous expense of acquiring such cutting-edge technology during a still uncertain economic climate, and to resolve the deadlock, Fry sought the support of Howard Hughes. Hughes's first tentative investment in TNWA stock that same year was small in scale but immense in consequence, as within a few years it would grow into outright control of the company, and by 1940, Hughes was TNWA's dominant shareholder, though he preferred to operate from behind the scenes rather than occupy a formal executive office, and through his Hughes Tool Company, he began to shape the airline's destiny according to his grand vision of technological supremacy and design excellence. That vision bore fruit with the arrival of the Boeing 307 Stratoliner in 1940, with these aircraft, the world's first pressurized airliners, being able to carry passengers serenely above the clouds, avoiding weather systems that once grounded or delayed flights, and for the public proved to be a revelation, and was the first true experience of smooth high-altitude flight. The Second World War, however, brought an abrupt change, with civilian flying being drastically curtailed, and TNWA's Stratoliners were requisitioned by the US Army Air Forces, with the airline's aircraft and crews being placed under contract to operate essential transatlantic courier routes, carrying personnel, mail, and equipment between Washington, Africa, and Europe. Though the war disrupted normal operations, it also gave TNWA invaluable experience in long-range navigation and overseas logistics, while at the same time, Hughes and Fry were already planning for peace, and working in close collaboration with Lockheed's engineers, they conceived an entirely new airliner that would surpass anything yet built, with the result being the Lockheed Constellation, a masterpiece of aerodynamic design. Its slender, dolphin-shaped fuselage and graceful triple-tail arrangement made it instantly recognizable, while its four Wright Cyclone engines gave it a top cruising speed of 300 miles per hour, an extraordinary figure for the era, with the prototype, designated the C-69 for military use, first flying in 1943, while in 1944, Hughes and Fry personally flew one from Burbank, California to Washington, D.C. in less than 7 hours, a record-breaking journey that captured the world's imagination and foreshadowed the dawning of the modern airline age. When the war finally ended, TNWA stood poised to take full advantage of its hard-earned expertise, and in association with Hughes' technological daring, it was awarded transatlantic routes in recognition of its wartime service, ending Pan American Airways' long-standing monopoly on international travel, while on February 5, 1946, TNWA inaugurated its first scheduled service from New York to Paris, operated by the Lockheed Constellation Star of Paris. Within months, its elegant constellations were linking New York with London, Rome, and Cairo, and ambitious plans were drawn up for routes extending as far as Bombay, Karachi, and beyond. Though beneath the glamour, internal tensions were mounting, with Hughes's increasing control over the company exercised through his private corporate structures, creating friction with the board and Fry himself. The airline's rapid post-war expansion had been financed largely through Hughes's personal resources, a risky strategy that left TNWA heavily indebted and dependent on his continued goodwill. But by 1946, the company's losses had reached over $14 million, with the strain between the visionary and the practical administrator becoming untenable, and in 1947 Fry was forced to resign. Hughes assumed near total authority, installing executives loyal to him and continuing to finance aircraft purchases through the Hughes Tool Company, a practice that would later embroil TNWA in years of legal and financial complications. But despite the turmoil, the airline pressed forward, and under its new management, TNWA ordered additional Lockheed L-749 Constellations, a longer-range, more capable version of the earlier aircraft. These entered service from 1948, enhancing TNWA's reputation as the airline of technical sophistication and style, while at the same time, the company invested in modernizing its domestic network, introducing the Martin 202 and later 404, with these smaller twin-engined airliners offering passengers on shorter routes the same attention to comfort and reliability that defined TNWA's transatlantic services. By the start of the 1950s, the company had already outgrown its earlier title of Transcontinental and Western Air, and in May 1950 the name was formally changed to World Airlines, a confident and ambitious declaration of the carrier's intentions in the dynamic, optimistic climate of the post-war world, with Howard Hughes being the relentless and often unpredictable driving force behind this ambition. His fascination with speed, efficiency, and innovation bordered on obsession, and his determination to make TWA not only profitable but glamorous ensured that it became synonymous with the very idea of luxury in air travel, while the experienced and steady company president Ralph Damon pursued an increasingly ambitious transatlantic network, extending its routes from New York and Washington to Paris, London, and beyond to the Middle East and India. Damon's leadership brought balance to Hughes's erratic brilliance, translating vision into disciplined growth, and by the middle of the decade, the airline's map stretched across both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, linking North America with Europe, North Africa, and Asia, with TWA aircraft visible in Rome, Athens, Cairo, and Bombay, turning once distant destinations into reachable realities for a growing middle class eager to see the world. The numbers told the story of this expansion, and in 1948 TWA carried 48,000 passengers across the Atlantic, while by 1960 that figure had soared to nearly 250,000, while on the domestic front, the airline consolidated its operations around Kansas City, which served as its operational heart, though the Great Flood of 1951, which devastated much of the region, forced a major relocation and prompted TWA to rethink its infrastructure. When its maintenance and overhaul base at Fairfax Airport was destroyed by the rising waters, the company worked swiftly with local authorities to build a new and more modern facility north of the city, a development that would later evolve into Kansas City International Airport, with this catastrophe, far from crippling the airline, becoming a catalyst for renewal, while technological prowess during the decade remained relentless and exhilarating. In 1953, TWA introduced the stretched L-1049 Super Constellation, which offered transcontinental passengers an unprecedented blend of speed, reliability, and comfort, while the following year, the company unveiled a significant innovation in the form of multiple-class service with distinct first and economy cabins, with this change democratizing air travel, making it accessible to a wider range of passengers, and the concept soon became an industry standard. By the middle of the 1950s, the airline had also launched non-stop services between Los Angeles and London, while later variants of the Constellation, including the L-1049G Super G and from 1957 the elegant L-1649 Starliner, extended range and performance even further, enabling non-stop crossings between New York and virtually any European capital, and for a brief but brilliant moment, TWA could rightly claim to offer the finest piston engine service in the world, combining technological mastery with a level of onboard luxury that had since passed into legend. Yet by the close of the decade, the airline was now being overtaken in the race into the jet age, with Hughes's insistence on personal control over aircraft purchases, coupled with his increasingly erratic decision-making, creating delays and confusion at the very moment when speed and decisiveness were essential, with 1955 seeing in place an extraordinary order for 33 Boeing 707s and 30 Convair 880s, a staggering financial commitment of nearly $500 million. However, his refusal to release the necessary funds promptly, his tendency to interfere with manufacturers, and his distrust of his own executives strained relationships and alarmed the airline's board, with the result being that rivals such as American Airlines and Pan American were able to introduce pure jet service before TWA, eroding its technological lead and undermining the reputation it had built over the previous decade. By 1960, TWA finally took delivery of its first Boeing 707s and Convair 880s, entering the jet age belatedly, but with characteristic flair, with the inaugural 707 service between New York and Los Angeles being launched only 2 months after American Airlines, and though slightly behind, TWA's attention to style and service helped it to regain lost ground, with the new jets promising speed, smoothness, and a sense of futuristic excitement that reignited public enthusiasm for the brand, and by 1967, the last of the famous Connies were withdrawn from the fleet. Nevertheless, beneath the surface glamour lay growing tensions between Hughes and TWA's senior management, with his increasingly erratic behavior, his refusal to delegate authority, and his obsessive secrecy beginning to threaten the airline's financial health and long-term stability, with legal battles looming, investors growing restless, and the company on the brink of a corporate reckoning. Hughes' departure from TWA, long delayed and fraught with litigation, finally came about through a series of intricate financial and legal maneuvers that culminated in 1966, and the sale of his vast holding of stock not only made Hughes enormously wealthier, but liberated the airline from the unpredictable and often obstructive interventions of its former owner. In the aftermath, under the steady leadership of Charles C. Tillinghast Jr., TWA sought both stability and diversification, and the company was reorganized as the Trans World Corporation, acquiring interest in Hilton International, Canteen Corporation, and Century 21 Real Estate, among others, in an ambitious attempt to balance the cyclical nature of airline profits with more dependable sources of income. For a time, this corporate strategy appeared to pay off handsomely, and TWA reported solid earnings by the middle of the decade, its share prices rising dramatically on the New York Stock Exchange, and its reputation for style, technical excellence, and attentive service remaining undimmed in the eyes of the traveling public. The early 1960s were also defined by the airline's expanding international network and a renewed confidence in its global mission, with the end of Hughes' dominance bringing with it a far more pragmatic and commercially focused policy, and TWA's management moved swiftly to assert the airline's strength on the North Atlantic and beyond, and by 1969, after years of strategic scheduling, fleet modernization, and careful marketing, it had overtaken Pan American in transatlantic passenger numbers. From its European bases, the airline's routes extended deep into Africa and the Middle East, connecting cities such as Nairobi, Cairo, and Tehran to New York and Los Angeles, while late in the decade, extensions were approved that pushed the network further still across the Pacific and into Asia, finally creating a genuine round-the-world service, and the company's marketing mirrored this ambition, positioning TWA as an aspirational global brand. Architecturally, TWA also captured the spirit of the age through its new terminal at New York's Idlewild Airport, later renamed John F. Kennedy International, with the Trans-World Flight Center, designed by the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen, opening in 1962 and embodied in concrete and glass the very idea of flight itself, with its soaring bird-like curves, its dramatic vaulted ceilings, and its fluid interior spaces, the design becoming an instant icon of mid-century modernism and a physical manifestation of the optimism that surrounded the jet age. In-flight innovation kept pace with these architectural and aesthetic achievements, with TWA becoming one of the first major airlines to introduce feature-length in-flight films, transforming long journeys into a form of airborne entertainment, while it also refined its first-class service into an art form, offering menus designed by renowned chefs and wines selected from the finest cellars of Europe and California. By the latter years of the decade, the aviation industry once again stood on the brink of transformation, with the introduction of wide-body airliners promising a revolution in capacity and comfort, and TWA was determined not to repeat the hesitancy that had delayed its entry into the original jet era, with preparations beginning in earnest initially for the Boeing 747 and the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar ordered soon afterwards to serve medium and long-range routes. For all its achievements, the 1960s were not without its trials, though, as the cost of modernization was immense, and although TWA enjoyed healthy profits throughout much of the decade, the heavy borrowing required to finance new aircraft and facilities placed increasing strain on the balance sheet, while the diversification strategy pursued through Trans World Corporation, though imaginative and in many respects ahead of its time, occasionally distracted senior management from the core business of running a global airline. The arrival of its first Boeing 747 in 1970 was greeted with great fanfare and a sense of occasion that seemed to belong to another age, arriving for the first time at London Heathrow in March of that year, the introduction of the 747 coinciding with the beginning of another ambitious expansion phase, as under Tillinghaast's leadership, the new Boeing giant was swiftly deployed on high-profile transatlantic and transcontinental routes linking New York, Los Angeles, London and Paris, while its sleek counterpart, the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, began arriving in 1972 to serve short and long-haul sectors. These new aircraft promised to redefine comfort and efficiency in air travel, offering spacious cabins, improved reliability, and a sense of futuristic luxury. But the economic tide soon turned sharply against TWA and its peers with the 1973 oil crisis, triggered by the Arab-Israeli conflict and subsequent OPEC embargo that sent fuel prices soaring to unprecedented heights, and combined with a global recession, created a perfect storm for the airline industry. The large and expensive wide-bodies that had once represented progress and modernity became financial liabilities, flying half-empty on routes that no longer produced sufficient demand, and TWA, burdened with high operating costs, struggled to adapt to the new realities of leaner traffic and tighter margins, and in order to maintain cash flow and satisfy creditors, TWA resorted to selling several of its 747s to the Iranian Air Force in 1975, a transaction that underscored the seriousness of its own financial difficulties. Despite this, TWA's international reach remained impressive, but domestic competition was growing fiercer by the year, with carriers such as United, Delta and American expanding aggressively into markets once considered TWA's preserve, with the airline's sprawling route map, the product of an earlier age of regulated competition, lacking the efficient hub structure that would later prove crucial to survival in the deregulated era. The mid-1970s also brought significant cultural and operational shifts within the company, as TWA's flight attendants, who had long been portrayed in advertising as glamorous emissaries of the jet age, became icons of changing fashion and social attitudes, and over the decade, they donned 3 different uniform designs by renowned fashion houses, first Valentino, then Stan Herman, and finally Ralph Lauren, each reflecting the prevailing mood of its time, from the tailored elegance of the early 70s to the more relaxed sophistication of its later years. Passengers continued to associate TWA with style and cosmopolitan flair, yet behind this polished exterior, the airline was experiencing internal strains, with labor relations becoming increasingly tense, with rising costs and pressure on wages leading to repeated contract disputes, and pilots, cabin crew and ground staff all faced uncertainty as management sought to impose stricter financial controls, reduce expenditure, and safeguard the airline's precarious position in an unforgiving market. Externally, the 1970s were a dangerous and unpredictable time for global aviation, and TWA was not immune to the perils of geopolitics, as between 1969 and 1979, several of the airline's aircraft were hijacked, most often by Palestinian groups seeking international attention for their cause, and though some incidents ended peacefully after tense negotiations, others were prolonged and frightening ordeals that played out under intense media scrutiny. Although passengers and crew were usually released unharmed, the repeated targeting of TWA, an American airline that also served Israel, gave it an unwanted notoriety and damaged public confidence, and though security measures were tightened, the fear lingered, and the image of TWA's red-striped jets became indelibly linked with the era's anxious political climate. In 1978 came the event that would transform the entire American airline industry, the passage of the Airline Deregulation Act, as for nearly half a century, the Civil Aeronautics Board had controlled fares and routes, ensuring a degree of stability and protection for the major trunk carriers, but deregulation swept all that away, opening the skies to new competitors and forcing the established airlines to compete on price and efficiency rather than prestige and service. TWA, like most of the long-established majors, had argued vigorously against the change, correctly anticipating that its size, cost structure and reliance on long-haul services would make adaptation difficult, with its fears being quickly vindicated, as the abolition of route and fare controls demanded an entirely new business model, one based on flexibility, low fares, and concentrated hubs, something that TWA, with its operations divided between New York and St. Louis, lacked in terms of geographical advantage or the market density of rivals such as American at Dallas-Fort Worth and United at Chicago. During the early 1980s, TWA's management under Ed Meyer and later C.E. Meyer Jr. sought to refocus the business on its core strengths, including long-haul transatlantic services and its image as an airline of refinement and sophistication, with 1983 seeing TWA's parent company, Transworld Corporation, choose to spin off the airline, leaving it exposed as an independent entity for the first time in its history. This separation was intended to free the profitable hospitality, hotel, and catering divisions from the airline's cyclical losses, which had been dragging down the group's overall performance, but in doing so, it stripped TWA of the financial safety net that had often allowed it to weather the industry's frequent downturns, with the newly independent carrier entering a period of heightened vulnerability, just as competition intensified both domestically and internationally. While the decision was framed as a logical step towards modernization and financial discipline, it effectively set the stage for a decade of instability, and the years that followed would see the airline become the target of a series of corporate raiders, opportunists drawn by its valuable assets and enduring brand name, among them being Frank Lorenzo of Texas Air and Carl Icahn, both emblematic of the aggressive, debt-driven capitalism that came to define the 1980s in the United States. Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation, already notorious for its dismantling of Continental Airlines union contracts and its ruthless approach to cost control, made an offer for TWA in 1985, but the airline's workforce, deeply fearful of Lorenzo's anti-labor reputation and the prospect of wage cuts and layoffs, sought an alternative buyer who might better respect their interests. Into this fraught situation stepped Carl Icahn, a financier from New York whose reputation for asset stripping and corporate raiding had already made him one of Wall Street's most controversial figures, and with the support of TWA's unions, who saw him as the lesser of two evils and hoped he might prove a more stable and pragmatic owner, Icahn succeeded in his takeover bid in 1985 and formally assumed control the following year. Under Icahn, TWA initially appeared to stabilize, with the purchase of Ozark Airlines in 1986, giving the company near total dominance at St. Louis, transforming the airport into one of the most efficient and strategically placed connecting hubs in the country, and for a brief and deceptive moment, there was optimism that the worst might be over, and with TWA's network stretching from coast to coast and across the Atlantic to more than 30 European destinations, supported by a mixed fleet of Boeing 747s, 767s and Lockheed TriStars, this projected an image of international sophistication. The airline remained a familiar presence at major European gateways such as Frankfurt and Paris, while also having the distinction of being only one of two American carriers allowed to land at London Heathrow alongside Pan Am, while in the summer of 1988, TWA could even claim to carry more than half of all transatlantic passengers flying on American carriers, a remarkable achievement that seemed to recall the prestige and ambition of the Howard Hughes era. Yet the apparent resurgence masked deep structural weaknesses, with Icahn's leveraged buyout in 1988 taking the company private at immense cost, saddling TWA with more than $500 million of new debt, with the burden of these financial obligations leaving the airline with little flexibility to invest in new aircraft, marketing, or network expansion, while in order to service the mounting interest payments, Icahn began selling off valuable assets. The most grievous loss came in 1990, when TWA's coveted routes and landing rights at London Heathrow, its most profitable and strategically vital international market, was sold to American Airlines, with the sale symbolizing the airline's diminishing global stature and effectively marked the end of its status as a true international competitor, with TWA, once a proud rival to Pan Am, and the closest thing the United States had to a second national flag carrier, now being reduced to an airline increasingly confined to the American heartland. Inside the company, morale plummeted, with Icahn's confrontational management style and his relentless focus on extracting short-term value alienating staff and unions alike, with labor disputes becoming commonplace, and a culture of mistrust began to permeate the organization, with investment in fleet renewal, staff development, and marketing being repeatedly deferred in favor of meeting debt obligations or funding further financial maneuvers. While TWA's maintenance teams retained their reputation for excellence and its crews continued to deliver professional service, the airline's public image began to fade, and by the decade's end, the glamour had all but disappeared, with the airline's once proud fleet now aging, its balance sheet crippled by Icahn's debts, and its competitive position eroded by leaner, more modern rivals such as American, Delta, and United. In January 1992, unable to cope with mounting financial strain, TWA filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Yet when the airline emerged from bankruptcy the following year, there was a cautious sense of optimism within its ranks, with the reorganization allowing creditors and employees to become the new owners, with the workforce holding a significant share of the company, a move that was intended to align staff morale with corporate recovery. The airline also relocated its headquarters from New York to St. Louis, which was designated as the central hub of its operations, symbolizing a fresh start away from the pressures of the East Coast, and a new management team was appointed, with 1994 seeing Jeffrey Erickson take over as chief executive, pledging to restore discipline, pride, and profitability. A signal of this renewed confidence being TWA's purchase of the naming rights for the Transworld Dome, home of the St. Louis Rams football team. However, the optimism proved short-lived, and ICANN's influence lingered, exerting a crippling hold over the airline through the infamous Caribou deal, a contractual arrangement that granted his company, the Caribou Corporation, the right to buy and resell TWA tickets at a staggering 45% discount, which astonishingly remained in force until 2003, effectively stripping the airline of control over its own pricing and drained hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue each year. This was, in effect, a slow bleed that TWA could neither renegotiate nor escape, locking the carrier into an unequal and destructive relationship with its former owner, and with the losses becoming unsustainable, 1995 would see the airline be once again forced into bankruptcy, though it re-emerged only weeks later, lighter in debt, but still shackled to the Caribou arrangement that would continue to suffocate its recovery. Despite these immense structural handicaps, the mid-1990s brought a concerted effort to modernize and stabilize the business, with St. Louis being developed into a vibrant and busy hub, with more than 300 daily departures by the middle of the decade, while new Boeing 757s and McDonnell Douglas MD-83s were ordered to replace aging aircraft, signaling the start of a long-overdue fleet renewal program. Within the company, there were tentative signs of a cultural revival, with management encouraging a renewed focus on customer service and a return to the gracious, service-orientated ethos that had once defined TWA's global reputation, and by 1996, the airline was even posting its first significant quarterly profit in years, and for a brief moment it appeared that TWA had managed to steady itself and perhaps even turn a corner. Those fragile hopes were cruelly shattered on July 17, 1996, when TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747 bound for Paris, exploded shortly after takeoff from New York's JFK Airport, killing all 230 people on board, with the disaster dominating headlines worldwide and sparking one of the most controversial aviation investigations in history, with speculation over the cause, ranging from a terrorist missile attack to a structural or mechanical failure, gripping the public for years. When the National Transportation Safety Board eventually concluded, in 2000, that the explosion was caused by an electrical short igniting fuel vapor in the aircraft's center tank, many remained unconvinced, but for TWA, the catastrophe was ruinous, as it not only inflicted enormous financial losses, but also dealt a devastating blow to passenger confidence and the airline's already fragile brand image, with bookings falling sharply, share prices plummeting, and morale within the company reaching new lows. In the years that followed, management embarked on another major restructuring, attempting to reinvent TWA as a leaner, largely domestic carrier focused on reliability and efficiency rather than prestige and international reach, and the airline concentrated its operations around St. Louis and New York, cutting unprofitable long-haul routes and renewing its fleet with modern Boeing 717s, Airbus A320s, and additional 757s and 767s. This represented a strategic shift away from the wide-body glamour of the intercontinental era towards a more pragmatic short-to-medium-haul model, while the Boeing 747s and Lockheed TriStars, once symbols of TWA's global ambition, were withdrawn from service, marking the symbolic end of the airline's role as a major international player. These operational reforms yielded modest improvements, with the airline's on-time performance rising noticeably, customer satisfaction improving, and internal morale, though fragile, beginning to recover slightly. Yet the progress was insufficient to overcome decades of accumulated structural weaknesses, and TWA's hub network remained limited, with its domestic footprint being too small to compete effectively with the expanding giants of American United and Delta, and by 1998, losses had again surpassed $100 million. In 2000, Transworld Airlines marked its 75th anniversary, but during that year, the airline reported a loss of $120 million, far greater than analysts had forecast, with investors, weary of yet another promise of recovery, beginning to lose faith, with the company's share price slumping, confidence evaporating, and by the close of that summer, it was clear that TWA was running out of options. The following January brought the inevitable conclusion to decades of decline, with January 10, 2001 seeing Transworld Airlines file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for the third and final time, acknowledging that it could no longer continue alone, while that same day, it was announced that the airline would be acquired by AMR Corporation, parent company of American Airlines, in a deal valued at approximately $745 million. The arrangement would allow American to assume control of most of TWA's remaining assets, including its fleet of aircraft, airport gates, and the once prized hub at St. Louis, while also taking on a substantial portion of its liabilities, and in the months that followed, TWA continued to fly under its own name, while the sale was finalized and the process of integration began. American Airlines gradually absorbed TWA's operations, repainting aircraft in its own polished aluminium livery, rebranding terminals, and aligning schedules. Though the attacks of September 11, 2001 plunged the industry into yet another crisis, with schedules being slashed, demand evaporating overnight, and thousands of employees being furloughed or made redundant. By the year's end, the last traces of World Airlines were disappearing fast, and the final commercial flight took place on December 1, 2001, when MD-83, November 948 Tango Whiskey, named Wings of Pride, departed St. Louis with Flight 220 bound for Las Vegas, and in the immediate aftermath of the merger, TWA's principal hub at St. Louis, once the heartbeat of its Midwestern operations, would become an early casualty of corporate rationalization. At its peak, Lambert Field had buzzed with constant motion, but American Airlines, in its pursuit of efficiency and network optimization, steadily reduced operations until the hub was finally closed in 2009, with its once bustling concourses, where the red tails had once crowded the gates, growing quiet and still, while Kansas City's maintenance base, a proud center of engineering excellence that had supported TWA through every generation of aircraft since the 1930s, followed soon after, closing its doors in 2010. Yet despite this corporate dismantling, TWA's legacy persisted in ways that could not easily be measured or erased, with its famous flight center at New York's JFK Airport, also known as Terminal 5, continuing to operate as an active terminal until December 2001, when American Airlines withdrew services from the structure, though by this point, the building had become functionally outdated and was considered something of a nuisance in the high-density modern airline industry. In 2005, a new Terminal 5 building was constructed around the former head house, which would become JetBlue's 26-gate facility, though the head house itself remained empty and unused until it was finally restored and reopened in 2019 as the TWA Hotel, while on the apron outside is a beautifully restored Lockheed Constellation, which was reborn as a cocktail lounge. Within American Airlines, the final aircraft derived from the original TWA during the 2001 merger, MD-83 November 984 Tango Whiskey Spirit of Long Beach, which was also the last member of the McDonnell Douglas MD-80 family built during December 1999, was retired from service on September 4, 2019, also was the final MD-80 unit to operate within the carrier. Though TWA's legacy as a formative member of the modern American Airlines company lives on, with Boeing 737-823, November 915 November being repainted into TWA colors in November 2015, a livery it continues to carry in service as of 2025. Ultimately, World Airlines would end its days as the last of the original greats, a carryover in name and style that reflected a more sophisticated era of American air travel, and continued to carry, even to the end of its days, a glamour of yesteryear that had been largely stripped from the leaner, more efficient corporations that would come to succeed it during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Sadly, TWA, for a majority of its existence, would be an airline in a downward spiral, as from the 1950s onward, the influence of Howard Hughes' erratic control, combined with the oil crises, deregulation, and its unfortunate shackling to corporate raiders like Carl Icahn, meant what had once been one of America's biggest and most notable airlines was stripped year on year, until, by the 1990s, it was essentially on life support, with the tragic loss of Flight 800 and an ever-contracting market being the final nails in the coffin of the once renowned World Airlines.